On the outskirts of a small town stood an abandoned circus that closed its doors in the summer of 1974. The locals avoided it, telling scary stories about how strange and sinister events had taken place in the circus in the past. The circus stood as a mute witness to past horrors, silhouetted against the night sky like a silent guardian. A group of paranormal investigators decided to travel to this macabre circus to unravel its mysteries. They named themselves the Otherworld Team and specialized in ghost and paranormal investigations. The team consisted of Chris, an investigator, Melissa, a medium, Steve, a technician, and Jason, a photographer. The evening was cold as they pulled up to the abandoned circus. The moon was shining brightly in the sky, and the white snowy walls of the building seemed especially bleak against the night. Chris took his camera with him to capture what was happening, while Steve armed himself with devices to detect signs of paranormal activity. Once inside, they felt damp and cold, as if the circus had welcomed them with a cold embrace. The ground creaked beneath their feet, and there were signs of bygone times everywhere. Broken chairs, tattered posters, rusty instruments. Melissa noticed that the aura of the place was so strong, as if the earth itself held the memory of the past. They began their exploration with the arena where circus performers had once performed. Melissa closed her eyes and began to make contact with the spirits she believed were present here. "I feel a presence," she whispered, "and it carries bitterness and anger." With those words, Chris began fixing his camera on some point in the arena, while Jason watched the monitor for signs of paranormal activity. Suddenly, something strange appeared in one of the photos, an obscure red glowing object that looked like a dishwashing sponge, hovering in the air. Steve began to analyze it with instruments, but could find no logical explanation for the phenomenon. At this time, Melissa began to call out to the spirits, and blurry figures began to appear in response to her calls. They were clowns, but not the kind you see in the circus. Their clothes were ragged and dirty, and their faces were hidden behind masks that looked like dead pale faces, grimacing with grimaces of horror. Chris photographed the apparition again, and Steve's instruments began to register high energy levels. "What are those entities?" Chris whispered. Melissa replied that they were probably circus clowns who for some reason remained associated with the place after it closed. The clowns approached the explorers slowly, as if fixated on some goal. Their masks had not lost their intimidating grins. Steve tried to contact the spirits with his device, but it began to make frightening noises, as if it had switched to the frequency of another world. At that moment, the room lit up with a bright light, and the clowns disappeared, leaving behind only a cold and dark space. Chris checked the recording on his camera and found that the clowns had disappeared from the pictures, as if they had never been there. However, the energy levels on Steve's instruments remained high. The researchers decided to leave the arena and go to other parts of the circus to try and find out what was going on in the place. Chris felt that they were close to uncovering the dark secrets of the circus, but they did not yet know what nightmare awaited them in the next chapter of this abandoned story. The explorers progressed deeper into the circus, passing by ruined rooms and corridors where applause, laughter, and joy had once rumbled. But now there was nothing but emptiness and horror within these walls. Suddenly, Melissa felt something approaching. She stopped and closed her eyes, trying to focus on that presence. "There's something else here," she whispered. "Something more sinister than clowns." They stopped in a hall of mirrors where acrobats and jugglers had once practiced their skills. The mirrors were fogged up, mottled with cracks, and seemed like frightening distortions of what had been. Melissa took a deep breath and opened her eyes. She saw her reflection, but it was distorted, and the smile on her face was gloomy and skewed. Chris examined his reflection in one of the mirrors and noticed that his face was drenched in blood, and instead of eyes he had black depths. Steve checked his technique and found his entire recording distorted with terrible visual and audio distortions. At this point, ghosts began to appear around them. Not clowns, but something else. Their faces were covered with masks, but this time the masks expressed not smiles, but pain and suffering. They were the souls of those who had once endured terrible moments in this circus. Melissa began to absorb their stories. She could feel how they had been captured and tortured in this place, how they had experienced the horror before walking away into the unknown. Her voice became uncertain as she began to tell their stories out loud. It was at this time that Chris realized that he couldn't stay here much longer. This place was so cursed that it was beginning to affect even their minds and bodies. Steve tried to activate his tech device to summon help, but it wouldn't respond. They rushed towards the exit, but the ghosts surrounded them, slowly approaching them as if starved for darkness and fear. Melissa kept telling their stories, trying to glorify their souls, and the ghosts seemed to begin to slow their step. And at the last moment, when they were ready to surround them completely, a light pierced the darkness. A bright flash illuminated the mirrored hall, and the ghosts disappeared. Chris realized that the moment of their salvation had come. They ran out of the circus, barely breathing and shaking with terror. The otherworldly team realized that the abandoned circus was a place of evil and suffering, where the souls of the captive performers and visitors remained attached to the place. They left the circus, but knew that its mysteries would remain unsolved, and the nightmares that haunted it would never be forgotten. It was their last visit to this cursed place, but the impressions would stay with them for a lifetime.